Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another session of Parallel Barking. My name is Larry Backer, and I'm here with my puppy,
Ariana Backer, arf arf.
Woof Woof. Today, we are going to talk about, and before I do that, I hope your year is going well. And unlike me, at least, that you continue to plow through your resolutions. I have a record this year
If you had any, I
for
didn't have any.
tanking. Well, I had one and it's gone and there it is. But anyway, so today's session, we are going to be talking about migration. Um, Migration has not erupted at this point, but what we wanted to do was take a little bit of a more interesting, perhaps, or a sideways look at migration, not just from the hysterics of its reporting in the U.S. Press media and worldwide, but maybe by looking at it from a different analytical angle, which may provide a little bit more light as you work your way through the issues of migration and you begin to form your own opinions about migration in general, principles, and then application in whatever context. And of course, I start by saying that the idea of migration as an American problem is a conceit that ought to be eviscerated
Yeah, it
as
dropped.
quickly as
Drop that
possible.
shit.
Yeah, it's a global problem, and of course contextually
Well,
different.
and hold on. I don't necessarily think it should be called a problem because in some contexts, migration can result in positive consequences. So it really, really depends on the
Right, but the reason I use the problem not, and you're right to call me on that. I don't use the problem in the sense of a negative. I use problem in the sense of managing the movements of people
as
while
an issue.
preserving stability
Right.
within the receiving state. So it's I guess the better word would be challenge. And the
Mm-hmm.
challenge isn't necessarily bodies coming in. The challenge is the management of bodies coming in a that is sensitive to human rights, internal stabilities of both the receiving state and, to some extent, the internal stability and policies towards the states of origin.
Right.
But anyway, so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at migration, and of course, having just said that this isn't merely an American problem, to some extent, the discourses that are developed within the now endless debate about migration, it's certainly well over 150 years old, and it's changed complexion over that time. That of course drives the media, and the media being at least a lot of the media that tends to drive or influence tends to originate or focus on the American problem, both and it's very useful both for the critics of the United States who view migration as the great failure of American policy and a sign of the hypocrisy of the American liberal democratic thing. But at the same time, it is also instructive and distorting to some extent for those within this republic and its neighbors that are trying to look at this from a view that is less ideologically driven. And that's really difficult in the US and in virtually every other country, because most of the debates are now not about the movement of peoples, individuals, and groups, but about the instrumentalization, the making of those people, their bodies as tools
Right.
in the service of whatever ideological or power enhancing agendas the people, the chattering people who tend to drive this debate are looking forward to. So
Yeah, and you also, I mean, and another key challenge to that is countering disinformation about migration and about the transfer of people across borders, online, social media, and the media you've been talking about is, it's relatively new, but there are definitely gaps in knowledge associated with, access to data, access to information, and unequal distribution of resources. So, that's also a challenge.
The data issue is actually a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Because that may be a marker of the times. It shows up in migration. And in fact, and I'm really glad you brought that up, and maybe hopefully you'll elaborate a little bit. When the discourse of migration touches on virtually everything but data. It touches on virtually everything but analytics. It touches on virtually everything but predictive and descriptive modeling. And in a sense, one wonders, when one sees this not only here, but in complicated tax and policy decisions, the 900-page omnibus bill that just saved our budget in the United States a couple of weeks ago, no one in their right mind read it. And there's lots of data in it. And so the question is, to what extent is in this context, is there a strategy of ignorance involved in this? The easiest way to manage the issue of migration is to make it an issue of passion. And the easiest way of making it an issue of passion is either by photo ops and singular stories, or by somehow inflaming passions that may or may not have, and that tend to skew both the realities of people crossing borders for all kinds of reasons, which we have done since borders were invented.
Right.
One way or another, everywhere. And the realities of how one engages with this reality. So what's going on with data and analytics?
It's actually not really something, it's not that new. To data and AI, for instance, is not really new to be used in the realm of migration. It's been used for a number of years, but right now and in the future, what the biggest challenges are, first, what I mentioned earlier, is the disinformation from multiple sources and needing multiple swaths of corrections from different areas. But other concerns are the lack of diversity in research, leading to just homogeneous data out there. So
there's research capture in a sense.
And then you also have to talk about the platforms that are out there and there's been some of this talk already, because of the disinformation, and we've already talked about this a bit, because of the disinformation on the technology platforms, is there a need for above self-regulation? Is there a need for platform regulation above and beyond the regulation that corporations give to themselves? But
here you're talking about data, migration data, in the context of policy discussions, or in the context of actually knowing what's going on?
Well, knowing what's going on and in policy discussions.
Okay.
Because when we're talking about policymakers would require greater accountability. They would need to develop mechanisms, let's say, for maybe this is just a suggestion. Like, let's say they would need to develop mechanisms for maybe a co-oversight, or platforms could provide access to that data for research and oversight to more people.
So what kind of data are you talking about?
I'm talking about, that's what I was going to next. This is data about where people are moving, who's moving where, when, why, and this is all personal information. So it also has implications about human rights, and about your own personal privacy. Right.
And all of that. But here's a question. and this is from my own experience of migration. Generally speaking, people who migrate, especially if they're migrating because of either instability or a lack of trust in the institutions of the country from which they're coming for either structural reasons or because they're in a dynamic and tragic stage in their development, they tend to be very untrusting
Right.
of officials. And I recall this growing up. The last thing on earth you're going to want to do is get anywhere near an official. You're going to run when you see an official. Now I'm going to use, no one does this anymore, but with a pen and paper, and now the modern techno equivalent. And you're really going to run if that official is going to be taking stuff down, the uses of which you either may or may not understand, and even if you did understand, you would be deeply suspicious that that is precisely what they're going to do. And so from my perspective as a migrant coming in, the last thing on earth I'm going to want to do is go anywhere near those folks, which means that the only way that you're going to get data is to go and liaise with organizations that migrants may trust.
That's the point, right?
On the other hand, if I'm a migrant, and migrants have very robust communication networks, if I get wind that in fact this organization that I thought I trusted is now extracting data and giving it or sharing it, my sense of
that's
trust
the one thing and that's the one thing I'm not clear on, and I haven't done enough research. Not sure how these organizations gather their data, but that is true. For instance, one of the most cited and widely recognized data sources, for instance, for climate-related disaster data and migrant data is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the IDMC. Mm-hmm. They're very well known for disaster displacement, and they compile information on, disasters at a country level. So I'm not quite sure how they gather that information, where they pull that data. I know there are databases, public databases available that people can pull from, but I'm not.
And we're speaking, of course, of a country with a tremendous amount of capacity and resources. But what happens if we move, for example, from the current migration pattern? Well, in the U.S., it's difficult because it's global, but the most widely known is up from the south and then through Canada. What happens if we move our gaze from there, let's say, to the extraordinarily robust and now a little bit on steroids, but traditionally well recognized migration, let's say within and among Caribbean states, or now between Latin American countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, not just going from those places to the US, but going between them, Paraguay.
That's a great point. In the last couple years, it's the first time, maybe ever, that the central countries have become destinations rather than only
transit.
Transit countries.
Well, actually, and I'm glad you mentioned this. This is shameless self-promotion. We've been starting preliminary research looking at the nature and patterns of intra-Caribbean migration over the course of the last century. We have a sense, and this is from personal histories and histories of people that we know, that before the current model, if you're going to migrate, you're going to migrate to the US, there had been a robust and fairly stable pattern of migration within regional groups that had its own dynamics and its own ideology and its own tolerance levels. and that has tended to be subsumed, and maybe a function of globalization, maybe a function of migration following the supply chain. It has been subsumed within larger patterns, but it hasn't been extinguished. And so it for us, it's we think it's fairly important to begin to not just understand, but to begin to give more heft to to a better understanding of these foundational regional migration systems that have been around well before migration became a quote unquote issue of globalization and a political talking point between the two imperial centers, the Washington and Beijing. The movements within Africa, of course, are ancient, for example, and really understudied with significant and sometimes tragic consequences. The recent ethnocentric violence in South Africa against migrations from the north, that is from Southern Africa, but now South Africa, is something that tends, because of other things, the sensitivity to arguments grounded in race and these kinds of things. It tends not to be studied, although it's a rich source of understanding for migration patterns themselves, as well as the way in which, especially in these regional areas, the toleration, there's a sense of naturalness, and when the toleration points are triggered, and then what happens. And then you've got very tragic migration patterns that are the product of colonial ethno-tinkering. The British, for example, were very good at creating incentives to move South Asian populations into, for example, Malaysia, into some of the islands in the Pacific. I believe Fiji is one. The ethno conflicts that have resulted since have been substantial and largely tragic, but the migration flows, even current, tend to be perhaps less well, not just studied, but then embedded in the larger picture of human movement. This is even before we begin to talk about the new overlayment, which is the substantial effects on migration patterns, both at the regional, sub-regional, and international level, that is caused by the changes affected by climate change.
Right. Climate change is obviously a ginormous factor, but of course we all know the huge impact that the Ukraine-Russian war has had on the movement of individuals from that area of the EU.
Right. And war has been actually one of the big interesting subcategories of migration, because we're talking generally about ordinary course, although steeped in tragedy and challenge and the like, ordinary course economic migration, which fueled European migration to the Americas in the 19th century, continues to fuel political instability and migration. But war is a very interesting one, and for me particularly so, because it's in the context of war that one begins to see how modern states now begin to understand migration and its control as a weapon either of war or warfare, or as a means of politics by other means.
So, that's so great. Thank you for bringing that up, because there was such a difference in reaction to the migrants. People aren't calling, they're not, that's another thing.
Well, sure, labeling.
People aren't the labels are difficult right now.
Right. Labels are judgment, and you have to be careful.
Yes. The Ukrainians were allowed in much more warmly, much easier than to many countries like the US and Canada, for instance, than a few years prior, any of the Syrian or Arab countries. And that's a fact. I have numbers to back
Yeah,
that.
yeah. No, that's true. That brings up a very difficult issue. Again, that goes to the stability issue and the way in which and these are hard
They
conversations, right,
absolutely
in
are.
countries about how one preserves one's national character in the face of, for some countries, overwhelming migration. And the answer may be you suck it up and people come in and are absorbed, and that produces mutual change. That was, of course, England with the Anglo-Saxons and then the Danes.
Mm-hmm.
Or one worries about, in a modern context, the destabilizing effect of migrations that may create rupture rather than absorption. But these are conversations we don't have, and they're
We're not having
conversations
these
that we should
We
have.
should. We should
But
have.
much more interesting in both contexts, and again, this goes back to instrumentalization and weaponization. In the Syrian context, two things happen. One is that the Russians and the Syrians understand that that the creation of migration catalysts can be destabilizing in the region. But two, especially in the context of Erdogan's Turkey, they discovered that migration, being able to control turning that spigot on and off,
Mm-hmm.
can also serve as a very, and in a way, one really has to, he has to have a very deep conversation with whatever spiritual sources guide him, because right now that is very lacking. But the way in which you use migrants and migration for political ends, in this case, to put pressure on European and NATO partners, or to use it as a threat to destabilize, especially very small population Central and Eastern European countries that are still, many of them, coming out of the Soviet era, and to do it quite deliberately and strategically and quite
Yeah, you
cynically.
can see the
But the
music
Russians,
being used as
right, the
tools.
Russians did it, right, the Russians did it as well with the Ukrainians. But
Mhm.
there, part of it was, and that's even more interesting, in a country like Russia, where net population growth among the working elements, not the aged, but the young people, is either stable or declining, one can sometimes create circumstances of migration to force people to come in. They need to harvest bodies, and that's as cynical as you can get. They need to harvest bodies, and there were reports out of Ukraine that, to some extent, Russified Ukrainians, at least within their conception, were fair game. And that was, again, also part of this passport strategy of warfare. But the other thing they did was they used it precisely to get you to say what you did. Aha, Syrians are treated differently than Ukrainians, and therefore to engage in a discursive war by weakening the West's position in their support of Ukraine, and then to destabilize certainly the Eastern European countries that are still, and again, this is a region where borders were as permanent as the life cycle of a mayfly, where countries were still now just coming to the point where they were sort of kind of accepting the last set of territorial revisions, including accepting the reality of border changes that confirmed and, in a sense, celebrated the aggression of the Soviets and the Nazis in reshaping the map of especially Poland in September 1939. And that goes down hard in some quarters, but you throw migration in, and all of a sudden, in a fairly sensitive area, you hope for destabilization and therefore a weakening of the resolve in that conflict. But it's not the only place. We see this in South Asia. We've seen this virtually everywhere. We see it, the ethno tragedy of this with the Rohingyas in Myanmar. And so, and you can go on and on and on, but there's that instrumentalization, of course, is worth 2.5 seconds in the Western press, and then they just go off and go back to and to be quite cynical about it, the Americans' South American problem,
Right.
and that's
You missed
just
the air
absurd.
quotes, everyone.
That's right. In Europe, of course, the focus is on the Middle East and Africa. For a while, it looked like they were managing this fairly well, and the Obama administration, to its credit, had actually thought about managing this well, especially in the context of economic migrants, by treating this not as a problem of the movement of human beings, but as a problem of basically migration as a cry for help from the home states of migrants, and that if you're going to deal with migration, one deals with it by increasing the stability of home
The home
states,
state.
by increasing their economic capacity, which makes a tremendous amount of sense. The problem with that is in countries where budgets are limited and there's all kinds of people yelling for parts of that pie, that tends to be politically marginalized, which is a pity, because one way or another, you're going to have to deal with this. So you're either going to have to deal with this in terms of diverting budgetary money to absorbing migrants that come in, or if you're in a prior administration dealing with the policing of this thing, they both cost money, or you're going to take that money and you're going to build a more robust economy and a more stable economic system in home states. And
Yeah, I
your
think
choice.
every administration is looking for a solution that costs no money or very cheap, and that just does not exist. There is no solution like that. I
No,
think
exactly right.
absolutely right, that just have to bite the bullet and understand that solving these kinds of problems require investment and they require resources.
No, exactly right.
That's the bottom
And
line.
and one last point, and then I'm done. This has been actually a fascinating discussion, and I go back to where I started at Cuba. The other thing that you can use, I talked about instability, but opening and closing the spigot, for example, in the U.S. Cuban context, has also been a tool of deliberately, in a quite strategic way. This goes back to the more generalized threats of the Turks and the like, but here in a very specific way. And perhaps these two countries have written the book on this, to turn the spigot of migration on and off is to use migration to destabilize a country where your primary focus is regime change. And so it can be viewed as a very interesting, and some would say somewhat problematic, modality of irregular warfare, where countries are engaged in not just competition, but where national policy is one that's directed towards regime change. And with that, this is a rich topic. There'll be lots more to say as things blow up, but any last words?
My last words are just that AI surveillance technology is spreading at a faster rate and a wider range of countries than we really understand. About 75 of the 176 countries globally are actively using AI technologies for surveilling, and that would include migration. So,
and that will be a subject of another podcast.
yeah, keep your ears open. Thanks,
Woof,
everyone,
woof.
and we'll catch you next time.
Woof, woof.